So let's get started here. Thank you so much for attending today. Good morning from the East Coast of the US. My name is Matt Wade. I'm calling in today from New York, not the city. There is a beautiful green nature-filled area of New York that is very large. That is not New York City. And I come from about 2.5 hours north of the city by train or by car. Today's session is going to be about Microsoft 365 groups, formerly known as Office 365 groups. And I'm hoping to cover some of the basics on how they work, what they are, and also clarify a number of the, I would say, very populous misnomers, confusion, things like that people kind of run through as we go through all of that. So a little background about me. Grew up in upstate New York, ended up going to college in Washington, D.C. My job started out as an engineer, designing, an engineer in the nuclear energy field before kind of falling into IT by mistake when SharePoint rolled out in my organization back in 2010. Spent a couple of years in the Caribbean and then came back to the Northern Virginia area, again, the Washington, D.C. area, and now I'm back in the New York area. I'm the co-founder of Jump to 365, which is the home of the periodic table of Office 365, if you've ever heard of that. A number of other infographics, my blog, and videos, things like that. If you want to follow me, feel free to follow me on Twitter or connect with me on LinkedIn. I will accept anybody's LinkedIn request. No limitations there. So let's actually just dive right into what we're going to talk about today. First, sort of a prerequisite. What are the technical requirements here for using Microsoft 365 groups? First, you're going to need to make sure that you have SharePoint Online licenses for everybody in your organization and Exchange Online for the most part. If you do not have Exchange Online licenses for the users and for the groups themselves, you're probably going to have a bad time. So you just want to prepare for that and be ready for it. GCC, the government tenants in the US, do not have Yammer, and I don't know if they're ever going to. That is not going to be an option here, but when it comes to groups, we're going to be talking about Outlook, Teams, and Yammer. So whenever you hear Yammer, we are talking about the commercial space, not the commercial or education space, but definitely not the government space. And one thing that I think is really important for those of you that are in the IT space in your organization, which is probably most of the people in this call, you should be knowledgeable about how all this stuff works because there's a lot of confusing aspects to this and people will be asking you questions about it if they aren't already. I know a lot of organizations are somewhat new to this since the implications of the coronavirus pandemic in March of last year, and rolling this out and just kind of turning it on is a very common practice, and not necessarily knowing exactly what's happening or what's popping through your system is a common sort of I'm not going to say bad practice, but definitely we need to just get something done. And as a result of that, the nuances of the Microsoft 365 cloud may not be totally well known across that experience. So make sure that you know what you're talking about. Hopefully this session will give you some of the background and also clarify some things for people as more and more of your users are jumping onto these features. So fair warning about M365 groups. First, they are confusing. The history dates back to, when Outlook was using distribution groups and shared mailboxes, things like that, turning into security groups. And then the concept came up, well, what if we added an online workspace to that? It's a membership service. It's all about permissions. What if we gave people a shared workspace to work in? And because a lot of these systems were sort of Band-Aid attached to the group concept, what features or what tools can actually support which features is not very clear. It's actually really difficult sometimes to even be able to get a clear answer across the different product groups as to how they connect to Microsoft 365 groups. So do not feel bad if you think that this stuff is confusing. We all do. Second, terminology is critical. If I use the word team with a capital T, I mean a team in Teams, or I mean the word teams. If I use a lowercase t, I mean a collection of people. Unfortunately, Microsoft has taken away very useful words from the vernacular English language, like group, like team, which we don't really have good words otherwise that can be used to replace those in the context of business. So I sometimes will just say that collection of people in a room that are trying to get work done, because I don't really have a better way to describe that sometimes. So my usage, especially of capitalizing letters when I'm referring to groups, teams, things like that, communities as well, that is on purpose. So that's very specific for this session. That is not going to be a willy-nilly type of thing. And some folks you will hear say, don't worry about it. Groups are groups are groups. I can't stand it when somebody says that, because it makes it seem like this stuff is easy, simple, and understandable. Groups are not groups are not groups. And the fact that anybody has the arrogance to try to boil down the 3 different groups types to say groups are groups are groups just blows my mind, because the 3 are so different and sometimes so unrelated that they can't even be called, within the same species. So if you hear that, that person is probably pitching you marketing fluff and or doesn't actually know what they're talking about. So just be kind of wary of that. If you hear somebody in the wild say that phrase, it is not something to be trusted. And after this session, I hope that you understand why. So the agenda for today, we are going to talk about groups, definitely. We'll dive into Outlook, Yammer, and Teams specifically. But before we can even do that, we kind of have to talk about this thing called Microsoft 365. So groups were confusing enough as it was until about last year, when Microsoft changed some marketing branding of Office 365 to Microsoft 365. Now, you might think, walking into this, oh, Microsoft 365, super easy. That's just the new name for Office 365. That would be incorrect. Microsoft 365 is the name of the Office 365 licenses for a number of the different license types, but not the ones that affect most people in most large organizations. In the commercial space, the government space, and the education space, Microsoft 365, which is the first part of the term Microsoft 365 groups, actually encompasses Office 365, enterprise management and security, so the EMS, the compliance, all that kind of stuff, and Windows 10. Now, when you dive into the actual licensing models, you'll hear of Microsoft 365 Business Basic, Business Standard, Business Premium, Pro Plus, O365 Pro Plus, the actual Office apps that are installable became the Microsoft 365 apps. That's great, makes things a little bit simpler. However, every single license within the enterprise, government, and education space is still known as Office 365. One of the names that did change, though, is Microsoft 365 groups. These used to be Office 365 groups. Regardless of your license type, these are called M365 groups, even if your license type is O365. And I just want to clarify that, because this is sort of Microsoft branding at its finest, where it's just incredibly confusing. It's a time-based thing. It's been more than, this change happened before the pandemic started. So it's been a long time now that we've been still on this O365 experience, or naming convention for all enterprise, education, and government customers, which has got to be a major percentage of their customers overall. So I just want to clarify that, and I realize that that may not seem like a big deal, but when it comes to nomenclature and making sure that we're using the correct words and terminology here, which in this session is going to be very important, just know that when I say Microsoft 365 groups, it doesn't matter what license type that you have, it is still a Microsoft 365 group, even if you are on Office 365. And if you didn't know that you're still on O365, now you know. There has been no update, or nothing that I've heard at least, about what the branding change is going to be for the enterprise, government, and education space. So that brings us into the topic for today, which is M365 groups. So the first thing you're going to hear, especially from those people at Microsoft that work on groups themselves, most of those people would be technical folks. There's not a huge marketing aspect to groups, because groups really are exposed through a different app like Outlook, like Yammer, like Teams, is that it's a membership service. And yeah, it is. I'm not going to deny that. But that's not how actual real people interact with this thing. Security groups don't really offer a whole lot of like day-to-day value. They can be useful here and there. You can use them for, SharePoint permissions. You can send emails to them. But, from the day-to-day perspective, the whole real win from the group's perspective is going to be that online workspace that comes with it. From the user perspective, yes, it's a membership service, but really I get an online workspace where I can get my work done with the people that I work with, my team, my group, whatever word you want to use in that situation. So when you do want to go forward and you want to get something done with a collection of people, a lowercase t team or a lowercase g group, most organizations are going to have a need to, communicate, store stuff. And that's what these online workspaces provide. They provide a communication method. Now there's different ones depending on which group type you choose. There's file storage, there's everyday project management, and there's going to be a central place to keep your notes. And of course, every team, lowercase t team, it needs that, right? If you're going to have a deliverable, you need a place to talk, a place to keep stuff, a way to track what's going on, and a place to keep a list of history, a running history of what you've been doing. And that's sort of at a minimum. There's more things that you might need, but at the very minimum, a team or a group really needs at least that to be able to be productive. So that brings us to really the biggest thing that separates out these different group types, which is a way to talk. So with M365 groups, you have 3 different options for having conversation communication within a group. First, via email, our dear old friend of the last half century, and for many of us, it's a blankie, a bit of a crutch. The second is going to be chat, and the third is going to be a social feed. And this is where we're going to actually get into real apps. So the email one is going to be in Outlook, chat is going to be in Microsoft Teams, and the social feed is going to be in Yammer. Now, when you create these within its given space, you're going to get that online workspace in one of these apps. And that brings us to the whole concept of what these groups are, what you get when you create one of these groups, and how they interact together. Now, this infographic is something I put together a number of years ago, and I try to update whenever there are changes within the group space. But it really shows you the separation, for example, of what you get when you create a Yammer community, or when you create a team in Microsoft Teams, or what you create when you what happens when you create a group in Outlook, and how that relates to other group-enabled apps like Microsoft Forms, like Planner, like Power BI or SharePoint, like Microsoft Stream. And also how these group types can or cannot interact. For example, if you create a Yammer community, you can't connect that to anything related to Microsoft Teams or Outlook. But if you have an Outlook group, you can benefit from having Teams as well. So there are some nuances there that are not very clear to begin with. And this is a great example where when I was trying to understand and really explain this to a customer, this is where that's where this infographic came from, right? Was me trying to be able to explain to a customer what a group is and why it's important and why they have these 37 or whatever 30 plus different entry points to groups within M365. Like if you go to the SharePoint home right now, you can press create site. If you go to Outlook right now, you can create group. Well, somebody at some point had counted that, and I think it was 37 different entry points to create a group in various different locations within M365. So this shows you how these things are brought together, but just for a little backstory here, I mentioned earlier, sometimes the product groups, the various groups that at Microsoft that work on these tools don't necessarily document well enough, or at least consider the interactions between themselves and the other apps. This infographic was really difficult to put together because the documentation for some of these things was really limited or even conflicted with documentation from other product groups. So this whole groups thing isn't something where there's an overarching group at Microsoft that says, here's how groups work. I mean, there are people that work on groups, but they're not like telling all the other product groups how to manage them or how to work with them. So unfortunately, this is kind of one of those mishmash things where you have to grab parts and references from all around the internet and put them together, or all around Microsoft Docs, and try to figure it out. This is the best case scenario I could come up with when I put the information together that I was able to find. Now, those group enabled apps also connect to a number of other features, right? So Teams, for example, connects to almost every single app within an M365 license. Surfaces it at least. Outlook can bring in a whole bunch of stuff. Yammer can bring in a number of things. SharePoint can bring a lot of that stuff right into SharePoint itself. So when you look at the entire overview of what O36 or M365 or O365, depending on your license type is, you actually have a lot at your fingertips here, and don't think of groups just being limited to those 6 or 7 apps that you saw in that last infographic. These apps can reach out and touch a number of other ones that are out there. So let's dive into the first group type, and this is the oldest one, really what Groups was built on, which is Outlook. Outlook gets all the love because people love email. Email has the oldest history, at least within this space, and the groups were originally built on top of Exchange. So that's why Outlook has some of the more built-in things when it comes to groups. So when you go forward and you create an Outlook group, you're going to get what you see here in this blue space. That includes an Exchange inbox and an Exchange mailbox. I don't know how many end users or everyday users we have here, but Exchange is just the name for Outlook on the backside, or when your IT folks want to sound smart. But because Outlook is sort of the default, you also get an Outlook group when you create a team site in SharePoint, when you create a plan and planner, which I believe is going away soon, and when you create a group in Stream. So you'll actually see the name of that thing pop up on Outlook, even if you weren't looking for a place to communicate. And that's the thing about groups. Once you create a group, you get all these services across these applications, regardless of whether you want them. And I realize for a lot of IT people, that makes us really itchy, and it's not something that we're used to. We don't like empty space that we don't need. But that's something that in this new paradigm of this sort of situation, we just kind of have to get over that and worry about something more important, because it's really not that big of a deal that you have empty space that people aren't using. So Outlook is going to bring together communication, calendaring, files, tasks, notes, and more apps as you decide to bring them into one portal, into the Outlook experience. You're going to centralize email. It is a shared mailbox, or you can think of it as a shared mailbox, but I like to think of it more of it as a shared conversation repository, more like a record as opposed to like an ongoing conversation thing, or just, I don't just CC the group email address willy-nilly. I would actually do it when like, hey, we got that contract signed, here's the contract, and store that stuff when it's important, and don't overflow the inbox with all the stuff when you don't need it. Now, the group email can be used to send out to everybody in the group, but it also depends on whether or not they subscribe to the group updates, which is important. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Then it comes with a group calendar. Now, I will say it's good. The calendar is useful, but it's still not a panacea of team calendaring that I think most people want. It's useful, but not perfect. So you kind of have to look at some of the limitations and really research this before you decide that you want to go forward with it. That's inclusive of your users. If you're in the IT side or working in adoption, that those people understand that there are limitations to this. It's not going to be, the be all end all of calendaring for that team. You only get one per group, and that's a limitation. So if you want to have a vacation calendar, but also have a meetings calendar where everybody is invited or able to join, you can't necessarily do both without overlapping on top of each other. You can still create shared calendars and do all that stuff in Outlook, but that adds another level of complexity and more ownership, that kind of stuff. So you just have to think about what your options are and do some strategy development on that. Now, within Outlook, you can also add tabs, so you can have quick access to other apps directly from Outlook. It's not great because it's not necessarily like in situ, like right in Outlook. It's more of a link to get out of Outlook or to go to that thing. But I mean, it's still a benefit. You can still add these things that they're available to you. The settings are important though, because when you have one of these groups, you want to be able to access your group content from directly from the group there. Again, these open up as links into different tabs or into a browser if you're using the desktop app. But the thing I kind of want to point out here is how people are going to get notified of the emails and the calendar invitations, because it's not a guarantee that people will receive email or calendar invites if somebody just emails or sends something to the group email address. That's completely counterintuitive to what I would expect personally, because I'm used to, distribution groups where if I email accounting@company.com, everybody in that group is going to get a copy of that email. That isn't how this works. This is more of a subscription model. You have to actually subscribe to notifications to it. By default, that isn't necessarily turned on. You as an IT administrator can go through and run PowerShell to ensure everybody is subscribed, but every single person has the ability to unsubscribe themselves if they figure out how to do it. Now, it's not impossible to figure out. It's also not easy to figure out, but it's under this group settings section here where you can figure out whether or not they get all emails and events. This is actually going to be important to know for Microsoft Teams. If you happen to use Teams and you like the concept of a channel meeting, when you create a channel meeting in a commercial or government tenant, not education, education is the exception, the people in that team or channel do not automatically get an invite and do not automatically see that meeting on their calendar, their personal calendar, unless they sign up for these, unless they're following this group. And that's a really important thing for them to have to do. And if you happen to have turned Teams on and you have disabled or do not want people to have access to Outlook groups, or a weird thing about Teams is that you sort of have the Outlook group feature, but it doesn't necessarily display an Outlook unless IT runs some PowerShell to make sure that that group information surfaces in Outlook. You can't even access these settings to ensure that you are subscribing or following the updates from it. So this is the kind of thing that you want to look into. This following of an Outlook group or just an M365 group based on Outlook or Teams has a lot of implications to the calendar for the group, to the emails for the group, to the channel meetings in the team, and potentially elsewhere. So if people aren't following, they might want to be, and if they are if they're overwhelmed with notifications, they may unfollow, which means they could lose out on the calendaring base or the calendaring benefits. So there's kind of a balance that you're going to have to come through there. So it's a little bit, that is one of the most confusing aspects, frankly, of M365 groups. So that brings us into Teams, which you have Outlook groups, you have Yammer communities, and you have Teams, which again, branding, but not diving in too deeply on that. If you get into a team, you create your team, you're going to get a space for chat, and you can break that up into channels, topic-based channels, which keeps things organized on topic and moves sort of threaded conversation from being an email, which is much more formal, less, I don't know, I find it much more clunky than bringing it over into Teams, and Teams will let you, organize things in a much more, I think, fluid and natural way. You're going to get those wikis in Teams. I don't know how much people cover wikis in this event, but I personally hate them. I generally delete them immediately because I find them to be very untrustworthy. There's no search results that include wikis. There's no backup to wikis. So if somebody deletes something, you can't get them back. So it's one of those things where I just get rid of it to begin with because it's not worth the hassle of dealing with user issues when it comes with it. But when it comes to comparing a team to Outlook, they're roughly the same. They come with a lot of the same content. You get that SharePoint site in the background, just like you would with an Outlook group. That's where you're going to store your files. You're going to get the planner plan if you want it. You can just add it to your team. You're going to get some space in Microsoft Forms. You'll get that OneNote notebook attached to the SharePoint site. This all applies to Outlook as well. But the one thing that you will get within Teams is you get, I mentioned a little earlier, the Outlook inbox and calendar, except it doesn't necessarily surface itself in Outlook. Now, the reason for that came due to customer feedback. I think it was summer of 2018. Microsoft decided that after you create a team, it no longer surfaces the Outlook group automatically. The group exists still, it just doesn't surface automatically in Outlook. And the reason for that was that all these people were creating teams. That team has an email address. The email addresses were being added to the global address list, the GAL in Outlook, and people started emailing those email addresses, but nobody was following those email addresses. So there were these emails that were being sent that were going to basically black hole addresses, and the team owners had no idea, weren't checking Outlook, and it was seen to be a big enough deal that Microsoft made that change to stop that. But that's where the access to the group settings went away. So the ability for people to follow or not follow the group, be included on channel meeting invites and whatnot in Teams, that's not accessible directly. So you can surface that using a PowerShell commandlet, but that's IT intervention that, in my opinion, shouldn't be required. The exception is in the education space, because if you're a teacher and you put a channel meeting in a channel, there should be zero reason why all the students in that channel don't get an invitation. I think that makes sense. And apparently the problem was not seen in education, so they were made an exception to that rule. But you have all this power if you wanted. So it's something that you need to know as you move forward. I think it's smart for users to know, because a lot of them will say, hey, can you get me a separate calendar? Can you make me a shared calendar? And it turns out, no, actually you already have one, you just don't know it yet. So it's good for them to know that they have that, so you don't double up on what you already have. So Teams in a nutshell, this is Teams Nation, so I'm sure you have plenty of experience at this point, especially since it's later in the day in Europe. But Teams really takes a whole bunch of features or apps in almost full from elsewhere in the Microsoft stack. Threaded conversations with files, threaded conversations from Outlook, let's say, files in SharePoint, even the threaded conversation concept from Yammer, shared files from OneDrive, and then of course meetings, chat, all that stuff from Skype, and they just wrap it up into a purple burrito, and they called it Microsoft Teams. Not the biggest fan of the name, but so be it. That's what we were given. But it does set things up into a nice one-stop shop for my chats, my threaded conversations, my file sharing, my meetings, all of that stuff all in one place, which is actually really, really good. As cynical as I might be on the branding aspect, on some of the nuances of the actual organization under the hood, the way that this works from day to day is actually very, very good, especially since when they rolled this out, it was good on both Windows and Mac OS. I'm a Mac OS guy, and Android and iOS. So if you're looking for some further resources on Teams, some of the ones that I like to put together here and make sure people are aware of. First, a full list of Teams resources that I keep, that I have put together is that first link. If you're ever looking for governance information, Melissa Hubbard has put together a great document on that. She used to consult on Teams. That's when she put that out. Now she works for Microsoft. And then a couple documents that I put together, etiquette on Microsoft Teams, meetings in Microsoft Teams, and then also just trying to keep up to date with all the stuff that happens in O365, M365, and Microsoft Teams. And if you've never looked at this second bullet on the right, this interactive demo, if you're in a role or a place now where you want other people to see what Teams does, but you don't really have a good demo to show them, you don't have content or real world examples to show them, this demo is probably one of the best things Microsoft has ever put out to show what their app does, in this case Teams. Frankly, every single one of their apps should have this, but of course Teams had the marketing bandwidth and the money, so they put it into it, but that really should be one of those things that everyone does. All right, so we talked about Outlook, we talked about Teams. Now we're going to talk about the third and sort of underappreciated group app, and that's going to be Yammer. So Yammer is it's its own little experience, and I'm actually going to spend a little more time on Yammer today because I think most people don't know what Yammer is or how it works or what use cases it has. And once you kind of talk a little bit about what it can be used for, people then kind of go, ah, okay, I can see the use case there. And I think that that's going to be useful for, thinking about that in the future. Yammer, I actually haven't really put Yammer to use very much within organizations because there just wasn't an appetite for it. But being a guy that spent a lot of time working in the knowledge management field, I absolutely understand and see the use for this because it is so good for community building, for sharing knowledge, for retaining knowledge that are not considered records. So more of the off-the-cuff knowledge sharing as opposed to the records management knowledge, repository type of stuff. So when you create a Yammer community, used to be known as a Yammer feed, you're going to get all that same stuff in the middle, right? The SharePoint site, you get access to a planner plan, stream video portal, forms workspace, all that kind of stuff, but you do not get any connection whatsoever to an Outlook group or a Teams team. One thing I should have mentioned earlier, if you have a team, you already have the Outlook group and the Outlook inbox, or the Outlook, the Outlook group, yes, the inbox and the calendar, right? If you have an Outlook group you can add Teams to it. So Outlook and Teams sort of have a relationship there, right? You can add one to the other, or one already has the other there. You just have to like know how to find it. Yammer, though, is really segregated. It's separated out, and there's a reason for that we'll get into in a bit. But just know that you can definitely get a lot of the benefits here. You just won't be able to kind of plug in or have the same group for Teams and Outlook if you wanted to. So a little history here about Yammer. So Yammer was a third-party product, started back in 2008. Microsoft decided to acquire it in 2012. I think the only major competitor to Yammer back then was, I want to say it was NewsGator. I think we were looking at that back in like 2011, 12, something like that. And then after acquisition by Microsoft, it was incorporated and basically groupified back in 2017, which could not come soon enough because groups were becoming a big thing. Yammer was clearly a use case for groups. What the hell? Why can't we get these things connected, right? So that happened, and people still ask whether or not Yammer is dead, because maybe some organizations aren't seeing Yammer being used in a lot of places, or they just turned it off, frankly, from the big picture side of things. Based on the investment that they've made into this application, I'm going to say absolutely not. It's not dead. I mean, yes, you can spend almost $1.5 billion and then decide 10 years later that you don't want to use it any longer, but that's not necessarily just the point. I mean, this tweet alone from a couple years ago at the SharePoint conference in Vegas showed some of the growth 2 years ago, right? So that's pretty major here. You saw some of the numbers driving it. But when it comes to actually what Yammer is and what it does, it's an enterprise social network. You'll hear ESN. There is an entire niche of people out there that cover ESNs within the corporate environment. So if you're not familiar with it, that doesn't mean other people aren't. But think of it as like LinkedIn at work, but private internally, or in reality, it's probably a little bit more like Facebook for work. And it's one of those things where you have to have community managers because people are going to act a little bit weird sometimes. They're going to be inappropriate sometimes. You have to make sure that you have to drop a hammer once in a while. And you're also going to have to ensure that management understands that it's now part of their responsibility. Frankly, it always was, that people's behavior on a community forum is part of management's role of organizing or leading their team. That it's the same thing as if somebody had printed a poster and put it up in the main hallway of the main building or the HQ of that organization. A lot of management people do not see that yet, and it's a real shame that they don't understand that it's literally the same thing as having that physical representation of posting something on the wall. So last year, I believe it was last year, Yammer pushed this hard marketing thing on the Year of Yammer, which was to really show the new Yammer, which had come out recently or around that time. And they are pushing really hard on this concept for communities and knowledge. They also push on engagement. I think engagement is sort of implied there, but I'm really big on the knowledge aspect of this. And that's because, my history as a knowledge manager, this is a great spot for asking questions and answers, labeling responses as best answers, connecting directly to Microsoft Search and getting answers that you want. And you can even now connect to Azure Bot Service, Q&A Maker, and other tools to bring in automated responses that can kind of help people. You can't do this in Microsoft Teams, or you can't do it nearly as well. You can connect to bots, sure, but this best answer stuff, this community-based stuff does not exist in Microsoft Teams. I kind of doubt that they're going to really push hard on that anytime soon. So this knowledge sharing aspect is sort of a big deal, and I think it makes a major difference. Now, I mentioned Teams because a lot of people will say, well, I can do all the stuff that I do in Yammer and Teams. And if you're a small organization or you're just sort of getting into the whole knowledge management field and you really want to have people be able to ask these questions or get through things, Yammer does things significantly better than Teams does. Teams is not a great experience for that kind of thing. Teams, people kind of have to be pulled in to join, or they're less likely to just kind of go searching around. And there's a lot of differences here. First off, think of Teams when you are like head down, getting stuff done. People in a conference room in front of their laptops, asking their teammate across the table, hey, what about this one thing? What do you think about that? Or, hey, can you help me with this one equation? How do I fix this thing in Excel? That kind of thing. These are these people that you work with on a regular basis. You have a deliverable, you're getting things done, and you just need to like have your people available to you. Yammer is more like you're sitting at that table and there's a whole bunch of tables in like a big, let's say, cafeteria or something, and you turn around, you stand up and you go, hey, does anybody know the policy on how to do the project management requirement for X? Because nobody at your table knows. That's the difference. It's a very simple difference, and once people understand how that is, they then sort of clearly see, oh, that's what separates Teams from Yammer. It's really this is my close-knit team, and this is my organization. And somebody in my organization probably knows the answer to this question. I have no idea who, so I'm going to just scream it out into the ether and see who comes back with an answer. And if it's somebody that's the expert on the knowledge, great. But even if it's not, and somebody says something wrong, guess what is the best way to get something to end up, guess what's the best way to get somebody to type the right answer to a question on anything connected to the internet? Somebody else says something wrong. That happens inside of organizations just as much as it does on Reddit or Stack Exchange or any other forum online. So you will see a major benefit here because the knowledge sharing can be huge. You can mark these responses now as correct or the correct response in Yammer, which is just major. You can now upvote answers just like you can on Reddit so that higher voted answers are seen as being the better ones. You can't do that kind of thing in Microsoft Teams. So some use cases that pop up, the question that pops up always is the use cases. What would I use this for? And there are a bunch. In fact, I think the Yammer team put out a blog post last year about 100 use cases for Yammer. Now, granted, like a whole bunch of them overlapped, so like I wouldn't have written it that way, but whatever. But the big thing is going to be communities of practice. That's the first one. Now, community of practice, you may also know it as a center of excellence, but basically it's the concept of these are people that all do the same type of work that may not work in the same organization. So think of like project managers or Java developers or Excel users across the organization. They all have the same goal. They don't necessarily know each other, but they are able to come together. Some of them might be more organized, like the project managers have to follow internal policies and how project management is done at your company. The Excel users group, not so much. They just want to figure out why their syntax of their equation isn't working correctly, right? Affinity groups is another one. User groups, like I said, Excel. Internal communications is becoming big because people can then comment, although I do know in plenty of organizations they actually don't want anybody to comment, so you kind of have to weigh that for yourself. New hires, the CEO connection is one that comes up a lot from Microsoft. I don't know. But the new hires one, that's definitely a good one. So a bunch of resources for Yammer as well if you're interested. For whatever reason, Yammer is not very popular in Europe. I don't know why. I don't know if that's like WhatsApp is huge in Europe but not in the US, and Yammer is bigger in the US and just not big in Europe. Don't know why. But it is an interesting app, and like it does do what it's what it says it's supposed to do. It's gotten major investments over the last couple of years, and it's really cool. But it does not connect to those other M365 groups almost at all. So you do want to know what you're getting yourself into. So if you have other needs where maybe you want to have that connection to Outlook or for other things, you can definitely do that with a team. And maybe Teams is better, and you can tolerate the loss in some of the Yammer functionality by using Teams instead. So I think that's kind of important to know. So that brings me to the end for today. That is a basic overview of what M365 groups are, what the branding even means, why they're called that these days, what the 3 different apps are, how they relate to each other, how they don't relate to each other, and hopefully that provides you a little bit of clarity as to what you want to do when you go forward using M365 groups, whether you want to use Yammer, whether you want to use Outlook, or whether you want to use Teams. They each have their own use cases. They each have their strong, strong suits and their benefits, and they all have their cons as well. So these are the kinds of things that people should be aware of what they can do, on your internal corporate sites or your internal SharePoint sites where you offer, we have these online workspace tools. Think of having a 3-column SharePoint page that says these are the group types that you have. You have Outlook ones, you have Yammer ones, and you have Teams ones. These are what these offer. These are what they don't offer. The decision is yours, but decide wisely as to what you want to do. So with that, I'm going to close out today and say thank you very much for attending. Some resources I have here for you can check out later on. The slides, my slides are always available on my website. I do know that the slides are going to be offered by the conference afterwards, but if you want to grab them ahead of time, you can feel free to do so. A number of Teams resources that I have put out there in the past, I would definitely recommend checking out, especially the keeping up to date with the, I should change that to M365 changes in the M365 world. It's very difficult to keep up with all the stuff that happens on a regular basis. If you're interested, I also have a new book coming out. Should be out at least in the US by the end of June. I think in August by the end of August in the EU. It's going to be a very basic like intro, like a Bible. Pick it up and, oh, that's how I do X in Microsoft Teams. So definitely check that out if you're interested.